Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How are you doing today? Hope you're well. Hope you're enjoying your Friday. Hope you're having some fun. Today we're going to have a very interesting critter chat because there's some interesting things to talk about. These unique little creatures that many of us are somewhat familiar with because of a very famous movie or two that have come out in recent years. Today we're going to be talking about clownfish. And I'm not talking about Bianca Del Rio. I'm talking about the little orange, yellow, or white little fish that was made famous by the Disney movie Finding Nemo. So they are typically orange, sometimes yellow, usually with white stripes. There is one kind that is black and white, which I'll put up some images of later. There are 30 different species of clownfish, and they are sometimes called clown anemone fish because of where they live and how they live. It's pretty interesting and very unusual compared to all the other fish out there. So for starters, they live in the tropical waters, so warm water, typically in the area around Australia and north through the Philippines, through Indonesia, and up through the western part of the Pacific Ocean, up into the area around Japan. Now from Australia, they also live kind of around the other side, going up towards India, into the Indian Ocean, and in little pockets of other spots in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. But they always prefer at least warm water, if not tropical water. And they live in shallow water. Usually you can't find them anything deeper than about 40 feet deep. And that's because of who they live with and where they live and what they need to eat. So they're not deep ocean fish by any means. They usually are found near coral reefs or other reef-like structures, so rock ledges, that kind of thing. And they have a very special relationship with another type of animal called a sea anemone. Now this is very odd because sea anemones eat fish. So despite that they don't move a whole lot on their own, they are capable of being a very intense carnivore that eats the little guys, little fish, little shrimp, other things like that. But the clownfish is kind of an exception, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that happens and why it happens. So that relationship that an anemone and a clownfish have with each other, scientists call that a symbiotic relationship. That's a relationship where, in this case, both the organisms benefit. So a little bit more about a sea anemone. We'll do a different episode all about them, but just so we kind of have some understanding. Sea anemones are related to some other animals we talked about in a previous critter chat, the jellies. Jellies and sea anemones are kind of in the big same family, called Cnidaria, and they have stinging cells. Like a jellyfish can sting, a sea anemone can also sting with its little tentacles. And that is kind of how it catches its food. They don't swim around, they kind of live in one place all their life. They have tentacles out the top. They kind of are like a upside down jellyfish with their tentacles up on top. And as a little fish or a shrimp moves along, they'll kind of sting them with those tentacles and then push them to the middle into where their mouth hole is, and then push them in, swallow them, and start eating them. So sea anemones are pretty good predators for anything little. And clownfish are little. The biggest clownfish only get to be about 4 inches across, so they are still really small. Most of them are in kind of the 3-inch range, so they're little fish. But they develop this unique relationship with the sea anemone where they live right in and around the anemone. And the anemone tolerates them and doesn't care and doesn't try to eat them because the clownfish provide an important service. They help to remove any of the debris or waste or poop from the anemone and kind of clean that up they also protect the anemone from other things that may try to eat the anemone. But the clownfish, they don't automatically just move in and everything's great. They have to develop kind of a resistance to that particular individual anemone. And they do this with something called a mucus coat. So imagine a little fish and it's kind of covered by this little like coating of slime that protects it. And scientists are still trying to figure out how this works. But they think that the chemicals in this mucus coat or this slime coat do one of two things. And there's different scientists that believe each theory. Some say that the mucus coat protects the fish from the stinging cells of the anemone, and that protection helps to enable so that the anemone can't sting the clownfish. And some say the mucus coat has the same chemical makeup as the anemone's tentacles, and so the anemone doesn't recognize it as a fish, it just thinks it's other tentacles from the same anemone. And so when it makes contact, it doesn't try to kill the fish at all. So it's still pretty interesting. They are doing some studies on this of how that could maybe benefit humans to help prevent certain skin issues or different things like that in a human thing. That's called biosynthetic process, where scientists learn something from nature and try to apply it or mimic it in a way that can help benefit humans. That's a whole topic for a whole nother day. So back to the clownfish. So they have this mucus coating that protects them from the sea anemone stings. They live right in among the tentacles of the anemone. We saw that a little bit in Finding Nemo. Now, Finding Nemo is for entertainment. It is not a documentary. It is not scientifically true on all accounts. There's some truth in there, but there's a lot of creative storytelling that happens there as well. So the anemone offers protection and a home for the clownfish, because bigger fish aren't going to try to eat the clownfish if it's living among the anemone, because the anemone might try to eat the bigger fish. And the anemone provides a really good place for clownfish to hide, especially because the tropical anemones have really long tentacles. So it's almost like living in like a jungle of tentacles. So the other predator fish may not even be able to see the clownfish when it's in there, despite the fact that they're very bright colored. The clownfish eats any little parasites, removes any debris that may fall into the anemone's way, and also helps remove any of the poop from the anemone and get that out of the space. And then of course it defends the anemone from anything that may try to attack it. Now in each anemone, there can be a different family group, we'll call it that, of the clownfish. There can either be one clownfish that lives there, there can be a pair of clownfish that live there, so that would be like a mom and a dad clownfish, or there's a group of clownfish. And so that's gonna always kind of be changing, and more clownfish may join in, unless it's like a single clownfish who lives in the anemone and that clownfish chases off any newcomers. That can happen sometimes, but that would be a pretty interesting situation. So it would usually move from one fish to two fish to several fish, and kind of cycle through the roles that they play. Now, if you think all that's interesting, hold on, because it's about to get real weird real quick. So with clownfish, they are all born male. All clownfish start life as males. They're all boys. And so as they're living in an anemone world, whichever one of them in that anemone is the biggest and most dominant will become the female clownfish. And she's the boss, she's the biggest, she's in charge. And so if there's a group of clownfish living in one anemone, the biggest one's the female, everybody else is a male. The second biggest one would be the breeding male, and then those two would reproduce and have more babies. And then the other ones that are less dominant are all just non-breeding males. So that's kind of an odd and interesting situation, but actually in the fish world, having the ability to change their sex is somewhat common. I mean, not all fish can do it, but a lot of them actually can. The different thing about clownfish is that they all start as male and one will change to a female. Usually with fish, it's the other way around. They start as female and the dominant one becomes a male. But it's a really interesting thing, and scientists are still kind of figuring out how that works and why that works. So as they're living in this little anemone home, and there's two fish, that there's a female and a breeding male, and they get ready to start a family and have babies of their own. They will work together to create a nest site. Now their nest is actually not in the anemone, despite what Nemo kind of portrayed. The nest site is near the anemone, so it's usually off to the side of the anemone, down under where the anemone attaches to the coral reef or to the rocks, and they'll kind of clear a little space, move any rocks out of the way, clear out any like dead seaweed or algae that's in there, and they'll kind of make this little space for a couple of days. They'll do a really good job to make it a nice home. And then the female clownfish will start to swim in and rub her belly against the bottom of the nest site. And then after a day or two of doing that, she starts laying eggs. Now she's just a little tiny fish, right? She's only 3 or 4 inches big, and the male's even a little bit smaller than her. So imagine how small the eggs must be. But she will lay anywhere from 100 to 1,000 eggs inside this little nest site on the base of, or near the base of the anemone. And the older she is, the bigger she is, the more eggs she's going to be able to lay. So the more mature females will definitely be able to produce closer to that 1,000 egg number. And that's also going to vary a little bit species to species of the different clownfish types. When the eggs are laid, they're little tiny round eggs. They are either pink or orange-ish in color. And then after they've sat there for a couple of days, they start to get a little darker and kind of turn into a brown or gray color. And then they sit for another couple of days, and then they start to turn silver. And then once they're silver, they usually hatch within a day or two. So the total time from when she laid the eggs to when they hatch, 7 days. So real quick time for the eggs. Oh, I should also mention, they reproduce by spawning. So the female lays the eggs and then the male comes along and fertilizes them afterwards. So once she lays the eggs, she's good, she's done, she's out. And she just goes back to living life up in the anemone and stays kind of up there doing her normal daily anemone thing. The male has a big job to do. So he will protect those eggs until they hatch for the 7 days. It's not like he's doing this for months and months at a time. 7 days, he protects the eggs. He makes sure that nothing tries to eat the eggs. Although if there's an egg that's infertile, he will eat it. So why not? He'll also keep everything clean, make sure that there's nothing, no debris or poop or anything else getting on them. And then he'll use his little fins to fan the eggs. That helps keep the water flowing around the eggs, making sure that they all have good seawater flowing around them to help them be healthy and help them get close to hatching. Now, when the clownfish eggs hatch, they always hatch after sunset. So they hatch at the end of the day, right as it's getting dark. And then the babies with the ocean current get swept up to the surface layer of the ocean. And then they live up there in the surface layer or around that area for 7 days again. 7 days is really important for clownfish, apparently. And then they kind of just live as little fishies, getting a little bit bigger. And then they start to move down in the water column and back to the area where the anemones are and maybe where their parents were. But during those 7 days, they're on their own. So once they hatch, dad's done guarding. He just goes back to the anemone, resumes daily anemone job and life. So when the babies, after 7 days, they're kind of big enough that they can function as a fully functioning clownfish. They will go and try to find an anemone that maybe doesn't have as many fish living in it. And then they'll try to see if they can join that anemone's little family of clownfish. So it's not necessarily their parents, it's complete strangers. It could be an anemone that doesn't even have any fish in it, and they'll see if that works. And then when they first approach an anemone, they have to take a couple of days to get used to that anemone before they can go all the way into the tentacles. They have to build up their mucus coat to that specific individual anemone. So there's 30 species of clownfish, and you would think that, oh, maybe they can just use any anemone. Not the case. There's only about 10 species of anemones that they can live in. The others will all try to eat them. So they have to be able to know what species of anemone is a safe species to use. And there's kind of 3 main anemone species that most clownfish will use. In some localized areas, there's more and different types of anemones living in different areas. That's why there's a total of 10. But it's usually the same 3 kinds. And the scientists are still trying to figure out how the little fish knows which anemone is safe to try to approach and which kind of anemone is a good home for a clownfish. And they think that it's actually kind of a sense of smell type of a trigger from when they were eggs and living next to it, that type of anemone, that they can somehow know from that time that they were a fish egg, they know the smell of the correct anemone to approach. So this is all very interesting and very odd, bizarre life cycle. If there's a group of clownfish living in an anemone, so there's one female, her dominant male who she has family with, and then some other subordinate males that are living around. Say the female gets eaten by something when she's outside the anemone and she's gone. Well, then that dominant male becomes the new female, and the next biggest of those subordinate males becomes the new breeding male. So it's kind of always somebody on deck to kind of move up in the ranks in the clownfish hierarchy. So clownfish can also live about 8 years, which is a pretty long time for a little fish. Out in the wild, 8 years. In an aquarium or zoo setting, they can sometimes live into like the 10 to 12 year range. Again, because they have medical care and they don't have to hunt as much for food. There's no predators. All those good things help them live a little longer in a zoo. So let's talk a little bit about threats for anemones, or for clownfish. They definitely would face any threats that the general ocean population faces, including things that are related to climate change, like warming ocean temperatures, ocean acidification, pollution. Those would all be threats to clownfish. But kind of their biggest struggle that they're facing is collection for the pet trade, because they became hugely popular through these movies of recent years. The increase for demand for pet trade for clownfish has skyrocketed. It's tripled what it was beforehand. And so more people are wanting them to be pets. And for a while, the only good way to get a clownfish to sell in a pet store was to catch clownfish out in the ocean. The government of Australia has put a limit on how many fish can be collected. If you're a diver out there collecting clownfish or other fish for the aquarium trade, there's a limit on how many you can take from one spot in one day. So that has helped that a bit. And then multiple organizations have encouraged captive breeding of clownfish, and they've kind of figured out this weird breeding cycle and all the things that they need. And so that is now a possibility, so that more clownfish in pet stores are now bred in captive settings instead of just being caught from the ocean. So that is also healthy and good news. So when I prepare for these critter chats, I always look up the animal's level of, are they vulnerable to extinction? Are they endangered? Are they critically endangered? And for clownfish, it's not listed. That is because the ocean is huge, the fish are tiny, and nobody has taken the time to do an accurate population census. They do feel that the populations are decreasing due to reef die-offs and pollution and climate change and all of those things that are negatively affecting the ocean, as well as collection for the pet trade. They do not think that any of the clownfish species are yet to a level where we need to be concerned that they are threatened or endangered at this time. So that's good news, right? There's still a healthy population of them out there. I did want to mention that most of them are orange or yellow with white stripes. There's a couple variations of how many stripes that is, and maybe a little bit on the shape of the clownfish. There is also one that is completely different. It's the same shapes, but it's black and white stripes, and it lives in one little area near the city of Darwin in Australia. And we actually have that species at the aquarium where I worked. So I will be posting some images of those fish later today. We have them in with the kind of common clownfish too, so you can see them side by side. So watch for that later today on the Facebook page. Also, special shout out to the Aquarium of the Pacific, which has helped me learn a lot about clownfish, as I was able to see them almost every day that I worked there. And they're definitely a highlight fish that a lot of people are excited to see. And they do have this really cool relationship with sea anemones. Also, a very special happy birthday shout out today to one of my conservation heroes. His name is Sir David Attenborough, and if you don't know that name, I'll be posting some stuff of him later on today. He is a jolly old chap turning 94 years old today. He lives in the United Kingdom in England, and he is a filmmaker. So he's made tons of wildlife documentaries over his very long and extensive career, and he's still going. He made a new movie last year. It is called A Life on Our Planet, and it just became available on Netflix. I have not yet watched it, but I intend to watch it within the next couple of days. So I'm very excited about that. He is an icon in helping people learn more about animals. So he is definitely a hero of mine, and big happy birthday to Sir David Attenborough today. I hope that you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today about clownfish. I'll be posting some more information up on the Facebook profile later today, as well as hopefully a video up on the Instagram profile. So until tomorrow, be happy, be healthy, take care of yourself, stay safe. See you tomorrow. Bye.